Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to everybody joining us on this interview, the second interview with our Religious Diversity Centre this mini-series with Rod Oram, our man in Dubai, as we've called him, although he's not in Dubai. That's finished and he's now in London, I believe. So a particular welcome to you, Rod, and a great thanks in advance for joining us talking again. And a very special welcome to Mandira Shailaj, who's the co-interviewer today, whom, as you can see, is a different person, a much younger person, and is going to ask some different questions, I'm sure, to what I'll focus on. I'm Paul Blaschke. I'm the convener of the Religious Diversity Centre Climate Action Group, and I'm very pleased to host this short interview with you, Rod. So thanks again. Okay. So let's just get started in with probably a pretty obvious sort of question, thinking about the highlights of COP28. You've been away from it for a couple of days now. So what are the sort of headline highlights, both the positive things and the disappointments in the outcomes from this summit that you would like to share with us?
Well, kia ora tātou. It's a huge pleasure to be with you. And my head is still reeling from COP. It's such a rich and intense experience. The main thing for me all the way through was there was a level of intensity, commitment, creativity, conviction, a grasp of consequences that really elevated the whole nature of this COP rather than the previous two that I've been to before. I have no idea what it was like in Paris in 2015 firsthand. I only could watch that at a distance, and there would have been the same sort of intensity there. But the grasp of the consequences of where humanity is heading is far more intense than ever before. And that's came through very loud and clear in this extraordinary hui of humanity that COPs are. Around about 100,000 people, about a quarter of those government officials and politicians, and the rest in various forms of civil society. And that's what made what is going to be called the UAE consensus, to sit alongside the Paris Agreement, gave it some worth. It was a big shift, particularly on fossil fuels. Of course, it is not enough. It's not a strong enough signal. There is not enough sense of conviction and grasp of consequences, particularly from the fossil fuel producers. But it does change the dynamic. It does change the direction we're traveling. And now it's up to everybody, ranging from political leaders to business leaders to individuals, to pick up that signal and make it change the direction that you're on in politics, or your strategy in business, or your personal consumption, and really start to run with it. Because the greater change is only going to come from people at a grassroots level, because we know that politicians will only do what they think they have a mandate for, have a consensus for, and that's a reasonable definition of democracy. Obviously, if you're an autocrat, you can push your own agenda for a while, but it eventually catches up with you. That's why this is an event not just for oil barons and kings, literally King Charles, and princes, literally somebody from the House of Bourbon in Netherlands, very active in the agricultural space, but for all of us. And then one last thing, the role of the faiths of the world was, and a sort of a spiritual dimension outside the faiths, more of a sort of a personal sort of spiritual relationship with nature, did have expression at this COP like it's never had before. So the Faith Pavilion, which was literally, that's its name, sat at a major intersection of two main thoroughfares in the COP campus, and a very striking building, angular and pointing up to the heavens, rather than just a sort of a slabby anonymous office building as so many of the rest were. And I sadly only had a chance to get a little bit of a flavor of all that because I was so deeply immersed in the negotiations. But what I saw and what I was keeping in touch with through a WhatsApp group of worldwide Anglican communion was fascinating. And again, that's a big step up. In the past, two COPs, those interfaith expressions or interventions into the process just happened in anonymous press conference rooms. Those people, those faith leaders, had a half hour slot to have 3 or 4 or 5 panelists say something very pithy and very brief. But in this COP, there was an opportunity all the way through COP and the 2 weeks of it for the Faith Pavilion to hold all sorts of events.
Thank you, Rod. That's a great introduction and a great picture that you've painted. And there are so many things I could pick up on. I've seen pictures of the Faith Pavilion. They're very easy to find on the web. And it is a striking contrast to the surroundings. So we might be able to pick up on some of those aspects later. In the meantime, I'd like to pick up on something you said about the real changes coming from the grassroots level. And I want to ask you a much more specific question about one, I'll call it a grassroots initiative on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, stemming back a couple of years ago. And as you know, it's something that the RDC has embraced very fully and got endorsements from New Zealand. It has a very strong grassroots component. And I just wondered, in all the discussions about phase out, phase down, and the various forms of reducing fossil fuel use, whether that Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty was specifically referred to, was it influential either openly or in the background, and any impressions or advice on where that's going?
This, as in so many of the comments I make, is superficial because I just was not seeing enough firsthand or talking enough firsthand with people. But the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a very powerful concept and initiative, but and it builds wonderfully on the concept of a nuclear arms non-proliferation treaty. In applying this push for treaties to limit the growth and stockpiling of weapons, and was trying to stop that growth. On fossil fuels, we're trying to stop the demand. We're trying to stop the use. So we're trying to stop something that's actually going, it has very real consequences now, rather than posing a threat to the future. And so all of the discussion around fossil fuels was about that dynamic. And the fossil fuel producers and Sultan Al Jaber, the head of the UAE's national oil company, ADNOC, and president of COP, was made it very clear all the way through. We're only meeting demand. And there are lots of people out there in the world who need a low-cost energy source, and our role is to try and decarbonize that source as we can. Well, that's optimistic. You can't do that, particularly when it gets around to burning the fuels. And we're going to keep producing until demand falls off. So that's why the dynamic is very much focused on demand and the development of alternative technologies. So that leaves the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as a powerful concept, but one that is struggling to connect the concept with very strong actions sort of on the ground. However, it's always really important through all of these things that some people have to keep holding up the essential issue and not being dragged down into the minutiae of trying to reach a consensus agreement amongst minutiae. Sorry, that sounds a very unkind word. And the immense complexity of trying to reach a consensus agreement among 198 countries. So that's why I think the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is important, because it's very powerful language. It's a very powerful concept. And it probably will struggle as an idea, as a movement, to give practical expression to that. But it's still incredibly important to keep shining that piercing light on the issue in that way.
Thank you. Once again, there's a lot to unpick in that, and perhaps on your return to New Zealand, we can do a bit more on that, but we won't try and do that in this interview. And I'd like to pass over to Mandira now. And I know that you've got some interesting questions to ask Rod and discuss with Rod. So over to you, Mandira.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for being on this interview, Rod. So I've got a quick question just to start off with. So it's awesome hearing that there's so many government delegates and corporate people coming to COP. But this year, were there any exciting new voices, like in particular youth at COP that you heard?
Youth has been an important voice at COP for quite a while now. And I think a really important moment in that journey actually came in the Rio +20 conference in Rio in 2012. And that was when Helen Clark was administrator for the United Nations Development Program. And she pushed very, very hard to get a very big youth representation in Rio de Janeiro for that conference, which I went to, and it was quite fascinating to see that play out. So we've seen, I like to say younger people, because youth sounds as though they might still be living at home or still going to school, which is, we need those people there. But at my age, youth extends well into young adulthood, and very impressively so. There were a lot of such people like that. Now, I will just mention one because I'm struggling. I'm sure her name was Faith, because I'm feeling slightly confused because it was it was part of the Faith Pavilion presentation, and she was a 15-year-old from Uganda, or is a 15-year-old from Uganda, and spoke very powerfully. But she's also deaf, profoundly deaf. There was somebody signing for her to keep her in the conversation, and she was signing back, and then the signer was voicing the words for her. And she was just such an extraordinary person, and I won't even put the word young in there, because she was just a person of such huge integrity and clarity of thought and conviction, that she spoke very powerfully. So yes, absolutely. And let me offer you another example. And actually, I wrote about this in Newsroom, and so it was a long piece. I was walking along this main thoroughfare one day, and I saw a group of young people, white. They looked North American. Indeed, they turned out to be Canadians and Americans, who were young evangelical Christian climate campaigners. And a short while before, down the road, they'd been in the OPEC pavilion, where OPEC was holding a youth gathering, which they found completely unsatisfactory. It was actually hosted by the Secretary General of OPEC himself. And they thought the answers were ridiculous, improbable, plain wrong. Later, shortly afterwards, they saw one of the people who had been part of that, one of the OPEC, a senior executive in OPEC, coming up the road. And so they engaged him more in conversation. And that's when I came along, as the conversation was getting quite energetic, I'd have to say. And it was fascinating hearing the knowledge, the intelligence with which, and again, I keep using the word conviction, that these young people were going through the issues with him. His answers were indeed terrible. I found myself dropping my journalistic deportment and sort of getting stuck in with them. And his answers were really revealing, because it showed that oil producers really think, pardon the language here, but I really do think they're God's gift to humanity, because they are providing us this energy to do things, and this heat and light and everything else. And this gentleman was saying, oh, there's 800 million people in the world who can hardly afford any energy at all, and we supply that energy, and we're going to keep supplying it. And you're saying, well, no, but photovoltaics in the middle of Africa make far more sense than building the East African crude oil pipeline across 3 or 4 countries and destroying environments in the process. Or another young delegate from Nigeria, from the Delta of Nigeria, representing the second largest ethnic group in Nigeria. It was an impassioned one-on-one that we had on the street. We would just sort of turn to each other to comment on something, and this turned into a big conversation. And it was truly revealing. And I thought that those young people, sort of by the side of the road, if you like, really caught right to the heart of the matter. And some countries are much better at bringing youth into their delegations, not just as an adornment or a little bit of advice on the side, but really at the heart of the negotiating team. Our New Zealand delegation, the official part of the delegation, government officials and politicians, there are some incredibly talented and committed people there, and they are young. I think one person I can think of in particular is probably under 30, the others are probably around that age. And they are very, very effective. They're extraordinarily knowledgeable, extraordinarily energetic. But they are doing a government job well, which is good. But I still think our delegation should be bringing in indigenous voices and youth voices, and integrating it much more into what happens in negotiating rooms, to be playing the conscience of society, to be delivering that piercing clarity on issues, to cut through the political obfuscation and negotiation rhetoric and all the rest. There are a number of delegations like that. Ironically, sorry, that's a terrible word, but anyway, ironically, the UAE was one of the best. So a large proportion of its official and huge delegation, because they were both a country delegation and in large part the staff, the core of staff around Al Jaber's office were women and were young. But I have no idea what role they played in the negotiations, other than they officially had a role there.
Wow, thank you so much for that answer, Rod. That was amazing hearing about Faith. And she seems like such a wonderful person, and I'd love to meet her someday. I guess leading on from that question, I'd love to ask, I think you touched on this a bit, but are nations doing enough, do you reckon, to include those indigenous voices and kind of gain the perspective of how we can protect the environment from them? Because they are the ones who really, cared for the environment, and I believe we can learn a lot from them. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
There were some really interesting examples, and again, coming back to some of the small South American countries, but also one of the big ones. So there was about a 3-day period in the middle of COP when one senior Brazilian politician had gone home before the next one arrived to be leader of the delegation. And in those 3 days, Brazil was very keen to announce that a young indigenous woman from Brazil was the official delegation leader for those 3 days. And I'm sure she wasn't just a placeholder. I'm sure that she was playing an active role. If I could offer kind of an aspiration for us in Aotearoa, it would be this. Along with the rest of humanity, we're trying to establish our right relationship with the living earth, a symbiotic relationship. We're totally dependent on the living earth, on creation, for our lives and our futures. So in part of that core of that right relationship is that we understand we are a subordinate player in that system. We're not in dominion, we're not in stewardship over it. We need a humility about that interdependence. And so that gets us to the indigenous view of the world where that's the case and common throughout all indigenous cultures. Quite fascinatingly so, because of course these cultures developed independently, before travel and mass communications, and they all came to that same realization. And so for us in Aotearoa, for us to really take to heart to our Māori worldview, where that interdependence with nature is the absolute core of what we do, is fundamentally essential. I find this at a personal level deeply fascinating because it's set me on a journey of what's my indigenous knowledge? What were Anglo-Saxons up to before they went colonizing the world, and before they were blasting through humanity with the Industrial Revolution? I'm very I've only just started that journey, but I've already found a few guides from that history to follow in that. And so it's not about us in Aotearoa all suddenly seeing the world, trying to be sort of honorary Maori, if you like, but taking that concept, giving life to it through our own cultures, because we're an extraordinary array of people in New Zealand. A figure I use all the time is that in Tamaki Makaurau, about 44% of us who call that place home were born overseas. I'm clearly one of them. We're the fourth most immigrant-intensive city in the world. And we just don't take that anywhere near seriously in us. I mean, we love Diwali and Chinese Lantern Festival and all that kind of stuff, but we're not working with it very, very deeply. So that would be my hope, that it might take decades, but at some point in the future, the delegation from Aotearoa will go not just to COPs, but will be out in the world, not just in the United Nations, but in gatherings ranging from gargantuan to sort of one-on-ones, giving expression, giving life to those utterly core concepts, beliefs.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Rod. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's really interesting that you're learning about your own history. I've never heard someone say that they want to study Anglo-Saxon history and see what they did about the environment. So I might read up about it myself. So I'll just pass back to Paul.
Okay, thank you. But I want to just stay with that image you gave of Aotearoa and its diversity and how it would be reflected. I just wanted to ask quickly, Rod, whether, of course, the messages that we got back from you and from other observers were all interpreted in our own experiences and with Aotearoa's experience at the centre. But was the Aotearoa delegation and also civil society representatives, were they able to sort of make any kind of impression on that huge 100,000 strong COP meeting? And for that matter, I will also ask about the small Pacific island nations, who I hear lots and lots about, and of course so prominent in the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty movement. But how did they manage to really occupy centre stage and get the attention of the conference at any point?
Yes, it's always fleeting. Even our Jaber, as president of COP, faded into the background from time for long periods, whilst he was frantically negotiating things behind closed doors. But yes, I'll start with the most powerful of those was our Pacific neighbours, as they have been for a long time, just speaking with such heart and humanity and undeniable, fierce logic about what's going on in the world. They were magnificent. There was a terrific member of the Pacific Climate Warriors, though Australian-based, rather than New Zealand-based, who had a number of speaking roles in the Climate Action Network, which is an extraordinary grouping of more than 1,000 climate NGOs from around the world that work very effectively together at COP. So CAN's very important. And then there was a Moana Blue Pacific Pavilion, and hats off to our government. New Zealand contributed a fair proportion of the budget to make that happen. Very lively programs, always lots of people there. And the most amazing graphic, because on the wall, because if you line up all of those small specific states and graphically set them in the exclusive economic zone, which of course connect across the Pacific, all the way from north of Australia to well past us, you can see that chunk of the planet is actually bigger than Australia and New Zealand, and it gives you a sense of the importance of those people as custodians of a big part of the planet, albeit oceanic, but that's even more important because we continue to drastically ignore the role of oceans in all this, because it's oceans that absorb most of the CO2 we're putting up there, and oceans are struggling terribly in terms of becoming more acidic or getting a lot hotter, or rising sea levels and all the rest, or being massively overfished and ecosystems killed off. So yes, they were always a very, very strong voice. Then we had the largest COP delegation. I'm defining that not just the political delegation, the officials, but what's rather quaintly called a delegation overflow is the official term, into civil society. That overflow official delegation ended up around about 100. But judging by WhatsApp message groups like Kiwis at COP, there was a lot more of us there than that. And it was lots of people had speaking roles on panels, or were giving presentations, or launching initiatives, which are really small in the vast scale of COP. But a lot of it is, we need this extraordinary nanoscale, myriad activities going on as we, try to build the full human response to all the damage we're doing to our environment and our climate, and how we recover from that. And so New Zealanders featured in those too. And often the audiences would have been small. People said, I only had sort of 6 or 8 people. But, those 6 or 8 people will take that off and tell, 2 or 3 people each. And so it multiplies up. It's everything counts, however small.
Oh, well, I'm fascinated to hear how such a vast gathering can actually be like a mixture, array of tiny little gatherings within it. So Mandira, I want to hand over to you for the last question, because I think we're really running out of time now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Rod and Paul. So I've just got one last question to finish off with. So the last time I talked to you was when the Religious Diversity Centre did a webinar with Dr. Jane Goodall, and her key message is of hope. And I've always kind of used that to guide my journey for climate change. So I just wanted to ask you if hope was one of the key elements that you felt at COP, and just personally for yourself.
COPs are this huge roller coaster, the whole spectrum of emotions, from ecstatic hope to profoundest depression and everything else between. And I didn't experience quite that mood swing, but there were certainly some highs and lows. I as we all do, struggle to remain hopeful a lot of the time. And I just always have to keep reminding myself that if I give up on hope, then it really is all over. Hope isn't everything, but hope keeps energy flowing, keeps brains fizzing, keeps you wanting to go out and connect with people and do things with people. And if you lose hope, I think you become probably quite reclusive in a sense. I mean, it'll strike people in different ways. But I do remain hopeful, but you can see I'm struggling with this because the heart of the matter is that we're beginning to get the hang of all this, but we're still moving at such a slow speed and scale. And a phrase I've used for years is that we've got to achieve this unprecedented scale of change and speed of change and complexity of change that humanity has never come within cooey of before. That's what's necessary here. And so what always worries me, which is always really quite close to the front of my mind, is how on earth do we accelerate and intensify and become far more capable at all that? And so I think we all need to keep reflecting, keep actively exploring how each of us in our own way can learn some new ways of doing things and can learn new ways to reach out to people, can learn how to work with people who are not our natural companions on these journeys, and to achieve that speed, scale, and complexity of change.
Well, thank you, Rod. That's so interesting, and I think a fantastic way to end this short interview. I mean, you've left us with a huge challenge, individually, every one of us, and then scaling right up to our own circles, our own governments, and then the whole world. Yes, it is a huge challenge, but I think we can finish by just hoping together that we can face that challenge. So I'd like to say goodbye and thank you to you very much for your time. I wish you a safe journey back to Aotearoa when it's time to return. And a big thank you to my co-interviewer, Miranda, for your fantastic contribution to the interview. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Rod. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. Bye.